Well, now we're going to be looking today. This is part 2. This is the Sunday school lesson for Mother's Day. I'm going to be pretty busy next week, so I'm not going to be able to have a chance to record, so I'm going to send this in advance. But this particular lesson is going to be on the God of creation. Last week we talked about why study Genesis. Now today we're going to be looking at the God of creation. Who is this God? And we're also going to be looking at the various views of creation, not just those held by non-Christians, but also those those theories that are held by Christians as well. And it is going to be kind of intriguing. But I'll be honest, the precept here is going to be either you're going to believe the Bible or you're not going to believe the Bible. And that's really what it boils down to. After this material is all said and done and we end this video, the people are, there's two choices to make. Am I going to believe the Bible and the God of the Bible, or am I going to believe the scientists and what they are saying? And so this is just really for informational purposes for all of us, because it's going to be who do we believe in, the Bible or science? Our verses today that we're going to use is Genesis 1:1. We used this last week. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we're also going to use this verse as our key verse the next time that we're together. Also, stealing some verses that the pastor preached on the supremacy of Christ last Sunday, the 26th. We're going to look at Colossians 1:15 through 17, and it says this: He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation, for by him, and that is Christ, all things were created that are in heaven and that are on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. All things were created through him and for him. And he is before all things, and in him all things consist. And that is Christ and his involvement in the creation of the world. And then we also look at John, the Gospel of John, chapter 1 through 3. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, again, like Colossians, through Christ, and without him, nothing was made that was made. Well, we could spend a long period of time looking at these verses, and we probably will the next time that we're together. But right now, those are the verses that we will use that show that God was the creator of the world. And not only just of the world, but of the universe. Now, there are many others. If you look through the Psalms, you look through the book of Job, and some other passages throughout the Bible, we could use those as well. But I just wanted to simplify things a little bit and use those three. So will be our key verses: Genesis 1:1, Colossians 1:15 through 17, and John 1:1 through 3. And so we had looked at 2 Peter, the last book that we looked at. And of course, we discussed this a little bit the last video about Peter talking about how God would one day bring this whole world and really the whole universe to an end very quickly by the power of his word. Which again begs the question, if he can put an end to the world that quickly, can he not bring this world and the universe together that quickly? And we talked about that Genesis was the beginnings of a lot of things, the beginning of time, beginning of the work week for us. I mean, that's why we have a 7-day work week, because of the creation story. But we want to look at today at some of the theories that are behind creation. And I apologize for looking at notes. I can't memorize all this stuff. But first, we want to look at the evolutionist theory. There are two at least, and there are more, but I just simplified them a little bit. They're called theistic evolutionists, and that is that they believe that a supernatural being, not necessarily the God of the Bible, began the creation process and then used evolution to complete the process. So they don't discount the fact that a supernatural being could have created the world initially, but they say that this God, not necessarily the God of the Bible, then used evolution to complete the process, a theistic evolution. Then we have naturalistic evolution. And naturalistic evolution is that there's nothing else in the process. All it is natural law and a natural process of things. Nothing miraculous occurred, but everything occurred within the laws of nature. And so evolution just took a naturalistic cyclical process to get where we are today, of course, taking billions of years. And that normally is what's taught in your textbooks today, is a more of a naturalistic evolution. On the other side, we have our creationist story or theories, and I use theories just, not in the fact that I don't believe them, but just for our purposes. The progressive creationalists. And progressive creationists teach this: the days listed in the Bible for creation were representative of an indeterminate length of time. That means the day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4, day 5, were not necessarily a 24-hour period of time. They were representative of possibly 1,000 years, 1,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000 years period of time. And I like to call them old Earth people, and I've heard some of these guys on John Ankerberg as they look at the creation of the universe. Dr. Hugh Ross was one of those. I believe B.B. Warfield was one of those. I believe J.I. Packer is one of those who look at it and say, well, based on what we're seeing from this world and from this earth, we have to account for the billions of years. And so instead of using evolution, what they were saying is that God used a lengthy period of time to create the world. Okay, then the second theory, and by the way, that first theory is held by Christians, people who believe that Jesus is their Savior. Okay? Then the second theory is the biblical creationist. And that is that God created the world in a literal 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. And they used the day that is used in Genesis, as the Hebrew word is yom, as a literal day. Evening and morning of the first day, they use that as their period of time, saying it was a 24-hour period of time that God created for each day. We'll go into a little bit more of that later on when we go to our next couple of videos on the creation story. But those are your basic ones. I know there are many others out there. I don't have time to explain it all. The videos would be just so long. If you want to know more, you can look those up in Battle for the Beginning with John MacArthur or Ken Ham's answer book. You can look those up and for more information. Well, let's look at evolution for a minute. Of course, we know that the main person who brought it to popularity was Charles Darwin, but he was not the first evolutionist. In fact, I believe his grandfather was an evolutionist. So it was he that put it into popularity with his story with his book of The Origins of Species. And he was the one who created the famous saying, survival of the fittest. That is an interesting statement in itself, because many people, if you study world history later on, you will find that many of your dictators, especially those who were butchers like Hitler and Stalin and some of these other guys who killed millions and millions of people, used this as a justification for their killing, that the people they were killing were not the fittest, and therefore they should die. And that's why Hitler really pushed it down on the Jews and called them subhuman. He called them subhuman so that he could justify taking their lives. And that's where survival of the fittest, even when Charles Darwin's time, was used later on down the road in our history to justify massive killings of people. But most people don't realize, and you won't see this in your science, but Charles Darwin was not really fully convinced that his theory was correct. It said in one of the books I was reading that he wrestled with that particular theory. He knew that somebody intelligent had to be involved in creation, but he did not want it to be the God of the Bible. And we'll talk about the reasons why that evolutionists do not want it to be the God of the Bible a little bit later. But he did not want to. And but again, he struggled with it. He didn't know that he wasn't fully convinced that his theory was correct. Now, in that science book that you read today, obviously they say, yes, he was absolutely correct. But if you read his writings and some of the things that in his diaries and what people wrote, he struggled with this. We look at the theistic evolutionist. Well, they don't deny a supernatural being was involved in creation. They're just, they can say, hey, I'm all for that. I won't deny that somebody supernatural was it, but it isn't the God of the Bible. Now, we'll get to that a little bit later as to why they don't want it to be the God of the Bible, much as Charles Darwin didn't want it to be the God of the Bible. Because the God of the Bible requires certain things from his creation. And we'll get to that a little later. So what are some of the problems with evolution? Well, I could have, there are books and books and books and books about some of the errors. I'm just going to kind of talk a little bit about some of them. First of all, the big thing that Charles Darwin didn't know, and a lot of your early scientists didn't know, was DNA. And of course, we know that is the code that is used in reproduction and to generate things. And what they found in DNA is that it is very specific to each particular species, and that it would be impossible for the code of one species, one species to create a brand new species. Well, the intricacies of all the DNA is the fact that DNA of one species is so specific that it can't be used to create another species. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't believe in microevolution. Microevolution is when species adapt to their environments. We do believe in that. We see that in different animals. We see that even in human beings. If you were to go and move to Alaska and stay up there 5 or 6 generations, and that 6th generation would come back to Florida, they would look a lot different than their ancestor who went there. They would have developed protective skin over their eyes. Their blood would have thickened, and a lot of other different things. Well, that's called microevolution, and certainly we believe in that. I would not deny microevolution. What we're talking about here is how an amoeba went to a monkey, and a monkey went to a human being. And, the DNA code does not justify that could ever happen. Now, how did DNA get here? Well, obviously, an intelligent being would have had to develop that DNA code for each species. Now, there is one guy out there who was some doctor of DNA who said some alien creature brought it to Earth, and that's just absolutely ridiculous. DNA shows that an intelligent being was involved in the creation of the world. We know that through the DNA code. The evolutionists also like to look at mutations. And, we see mutations all the time, and all that is the recessive gene coming up in certain things. Well, and they say that a mutation could cause a new species. Well, that's impossible because a mutation means there's an error in the DNA code, and although that can be passed on, it's a weakness and not a strength. And if we go back to Darwin's survival of the fittest, that does not coincide with mutations, does it? In fact, mutations do not create new species on their own, and they don't normally survive. You think about this in Florida, when we have a white alligator that is born, how long do you think that white alligator survives in the wild? And so it's actually just the opposite of survive. The stronger one moving on. A mutation is actually a weakness, and a weakness that causes vulnerability and causes that creature to die or to not move on to the next level, to the next generation. And so they like to look at that, but we know that mutations are usually weaknesses and not strengths. And also, just another problem, and there are many more than this, is language. So if you're an evolutionist, how did language go from grunts to written and verbal language? Think about that, especially if you watch all these old movies. How does someone who went ungo bungo 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 go to some intelligent language? And evolutionists have been given that question and they can't answer it. And so, the justification for us is that God would have given language. God communicated within the Trinity. God communicated to Adam and probably to Eve as well. We don't have that until later on during the fall. And then Adam and Eve communicated to their children and on the way down the road. So there was a written, intelligent language at creation and at the initial creation. It didn't take millions of years to develop language. The evolutionists, that is a very big weakness in their theory. How is it that language came into being through evolution? All right, well, that's just a little brief theory. Let's look at the creationist side. But let's first of all look at the progressive creationists. And that is, again, to remind us that God used an indeterminate amount of time to create the world. We don't know how long, according to them, we don't know how long it could be. It could be 1,000 years, like the day of the Lord is 1,000 years. Could be a million years, could be 1 billion years. According to Hugh Ross, it could be billions of years for each day. And of course, they define the word yom as not a literal day, but they refer to it in a non-literal way. Like they, again, as I've said before, the day of the Lord is 1,000 years. And they'll say, well, okay, that's justification for us that maybe during the creation it was 7,000 years. Well, thinking, or could be even longer than that. So 6 days, God created the world. And the seventh day he rested. Well, how long is that seventh day? If he took 6 days and it took him 1 billion years, does that mean that seventh day we get to rest for 1 billion years? If you think about the timing of that, so if we don't look at the literal days as a determinate period of time, then we might as well go to work and work for 1,000 years on Monday, right? That's just saying that we don't, that's kind of a ridiculous theory when we look at how Genesis defines evening and morning and evening. Well, they like to use this theory because it helps them explain the dinosaurs being on the earth before man. And then they died off. And it also explains the age of the world. Well, the problem with this theory, and there's many, is first of all, if we're looking at the progressive and we're saying that the dinosaurs came before human beings came, how could they have died since the fall did not occur? We have to remember that death did not occur, according to the scripture, until man sinned. Well, there would be no death of dinosaurs before mankind because no one was there to sin. See, there's an issue there, isn't it? Where is it? We know that the creation groans waiting for redemption. Why is that? Because man sinned and fell. Well, guess what? You can't have something die before sin entered the world. And we can just as well explain dinosaurs being on the earth at the same time as man, because as we look before the antediluvian period, that is before the flood, the environment was much different. I mean, we don't know how different it was. We just know that man living 950 years old, that's a long time. We don't live that long today. So people have theorized there may have been a canopy of clouds and water, like a water bubble, that protected this earth from ultraviolet rays, and that this bubble, along with the reservoirs of the water underneath and the rain, when the flood came, destroyed that environment. And that's why when Noah came out of the ark and began to eat, planted a vineyard, that he got drunk, because it's perhaps he had never experienced fermentation because of the heat of the sun had not been made that much of an impact. The hydrological cycle began after the flood. Well, going back to the point, dinosaurs are reptiles. And as you know, reptiles do not stop growing until they die. An alligator will continue to grow, grow, grow. Can you imagine what a 900-year-old alligator could look like? It is very possible that these dinosaurs were actually reptiles that were allowed to grow for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. And so they may have roamed right along with man during that period of time. And of course, before that time, everything was vegetarian as well. Before the fall. So, those are just some things that the progressive creationists have to answer, which they have no answer for, really. What the progressive creationists has really wanted to do is justify or allow the science that's out there to be compatible with the science that's out there, instead of looking at the biblical record. We have to understand that scientists look back, and the way that they make their theories is through observing through the past, which we don't have all the record. With us as Christians, we look at the Bible and we have someone who was the creator and the beginning of history. Why not just embrace that theory? He was there and they weren't. Well, let's look at the biblical creationists. Well, a day is a literal 24-hour day, evening and morning, as defined by the text. So we know that we can look at the biblical record. The second evidence of creationists is the genealogies that is provided to us in Genesis, as well as when you look at the New Testaments, I believe it's the book of Luke. Okay? If you look at all the genealogies that they put together, you're looking at maybe, the creation of the world no later than 8,000 years when it came to the book of Luke. Now, how do we know that? Well, we also know that in the genealogy record, what happens is that they didn't always record all of the generations. They just recorded parts of the generations. So it is possible, even with Luke, that there were some generations that were missing. But that doesn't mean that they've skipped thousands and thousands and thousands of generations. We're not saying that they skipped thousands of generations, they skipped some generations. So even with that, let's just say that the world is no later than 10,000 years old. We have to remember that when God created the world, he created it with age. Okay? Adam was not a baby growing up. And Eve was not just a baby girl growing up. No, they were married in the garden and they were able to have children. The chicken was around. All the animals were around, ready to reproduce. The trees were mature trees with age, obviously. So as somebody said, if somebody tells you the chicken or the egg, well, we know that the chicken was there before the egg, because God created everything mature and ready to produce. So, and also we're looking at the book of Exodus when Moses was on Mount Sinai. And you remember that before, this was God's establishing his law with his people. And in Exodus 31:17, it says this, it, and that is the Sabbath, is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days, this is what God said to Moses, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day he rested. So God testified to Moses, who would later write Genesis, that he did it in 7 days, and he used this to set up the work week and the day of rest for the children of Israel. He told the children of Israel, you can work 6 days and the seventh day you rest. Why? It's because during creation, I worked for 6 days and rested on the seventh. And again, as I said, now if these aren't literal days, and God is saying, hey, these weren't literal days, that means it took God a long period of time, and you have a long period of time to rest too. So if I took 6,000 years or 6 billion years to make the world, that means you get a billion years to rest. Well, no, it's literal days that he said. You work 6 days and the seventh you rest. Well, I know this video is a little longer than normal. We could have made 4 or 5 videos of creation, but we're not. So there's a lot more that can be said, and as I said, you can check out or buy the book Battle for the Beginnings by John MacArthur, or the New Answer books by Ken Ham, and there are of course many others. But when we leave this place, we have to understand when we leave this video, we have 2 choices, don't we? Do we believe the Bible or do we not believe the Bible? Even for our progressive creationalists, right? Those who believe that God created the world and that he is their savior, when do we start picking up believing what God says in his word? So we either believe the Bible and the record or we don't. If we believe the Bible is true, then we take God at his word. If we don't, then we're left with these theories, whether you're a Christian or an unbeliever, we're left with these theories that can never be proven and really provide us no hope. And again, it doesn't give us an explanation on how DNA was created for each species specifically. Think about that. It has to be God that creates the specific codes for each particular species. And really, why don't we ask ourselves this question, why can't we have the God of the Bible? Why can't we have that? Well, the big problem is people don't want the God of the Bible. Why? Well, because evolutionists like the word chance. But as you know, chance is not a force and cannot make anything come into being. It does not have any power on its own. And in philosophy, you hear this ex nihilo nihil fit. And what does that mean? It means out of nothing, nothing comes. And we can see that even as we look around and what we do each day. If I have nothing, I can't expect that something is going to come out of this. And that's what evolutionists are teaching. Out of nothing, something came, right? Well, philosophy would say no. Out of nothing, nothing comes. The evolutionists would rather put their faith in chance rather than to the God of the Bible. Why again? Because the God of the Bible is a personal God who holds man responsible and accountable for their deeds. The evolutionists do not want to have a God that's going to hold them accountable. Okay? Richard Dawkins says, I don't want a God I don't believe in a God in that way. I don't believe in God at all. And that's why he's a big, strong evolutionist. He just says, hey, I'm not going to be held accountable. There's no God that's accountable. That's why I don't want him. So Richard Dawkins could do whatever he wanted to in his life. And a lot of evolutionists, they want to live their life without having accountability. Well, that's the reason why they don't want a personal God. They won't want the God of the Bible who holds mankind accountable for their actions. This is the God that they want to escape from. So let me ask you something. In the end, who has to make the greatest leap of faith? The Christian who puts their trust in the God of the Bible, who believes that the God of the Bible created the world and set things in motion and continues to, as we look at Colossians, everything that was made through him and by him, and he holds all things. He sustains all things. Or the person, I believe, who has to have the greater faith is the evolutionist. They put their faith in chance, which, as we saw earlier, out of nothing, nothing comes. They put their faith in that. We put our faith in God. Well, again, this is just a brief video. It doesn't answer everything about evolution, but when we come back after Mother's Day, what we will do is we will be looking at the account story Genesis 1:1 and the first day of creation. I hope everyone has a great rest of the week. I'm going to send these two videos out at the same time, so you won't get another video till after Mother's Day. God bless.